AgileTO would like to introduce our guest for tonight. She believes that there's a great leader just waiting to emerge from everyone. Everyone, please welcome Marsha Acker.
Thank you, Haran. It's it's nice to be here. So I have some slides, and I'm going to share my screen real quick. And I find this topic of conflict and how to work with conflict in teams is one of the ones that I am most passionate about talking about. So we're going to dive into a concept that I wrote about in my book called The Art and Science of Facilitation. And it's around the stance of facilitators. So whether you find yourself in whatever role you might be playing, you're leading a team, you're coaching a team, you're facilitating a team, I think all of us in some way find ourselves needing to communicate with others in order to build relationships and get things done. And one of the tasks of facilitation, whether you're working with groups or teams, is to be able to stand in a storm. And likely we have different definitions of what a storm might mean. And so I want to give you a way. I think about storms as often when conflict emerges in the room, or sometimes when conflict actually isn't in the room, but it's going somewhere else and it's undermining what happens. So I want to give you a way to look at conversations and the way we engage in conversations as a lens for looking at conflict, how teams communicate, what makes them effective and ineffective. So this model is called the Canter four-player model. It comes from David Canter's theory on structural dynamics. And what he says is that the structure of our conversation determines the outcome of it, and that everything that we say, every sentence, every speech act, can actually be coded into one of four actions, which I think is rather fascinating, that everything I'm saying, even to you right now, could be coded. And it would be coded into one of these four. So the first one is a move, and a move sets direction in the conversation. So if we were maybe, let's say, a group of foodies, and we wanted to do something together, you know, back before a pandemic when we actually might gather together and do something, I might make a move and say, let's go get sushi at the 5-star restaurant on the corner. That would be my move. The next action is a follow, and a follow supports the move. It supports sort of the line or the direction that it's going. So I could add a follow to that and say, sounds good to me, would love to. The third action is oppose, and oppose offers correction or constraint. So I might oppose, or someone else might oppose me and say, hey, I'm not so sure, I'm not feeling sushi tonight. And the fourth action is bystand, and bystand offers a morally neutral comment on what's happening in the conversation. So someone might add a bystand and say, it sounds like we have an idea on the table. Just a comment. Or it sounds like we have, it sounds like we're not sure about what we want to do. So it's not supporting or it's not opposing, but it's naming what's happening. So the other piece to know about this is that move and oppose are the vocal actions of advocacy, meaning they're bringing something forward and taking a stand for something. Bystand and follow are vocal actions of inquiry, and they provide curiosity and more data. So it's definitely the place where questions and curiosity come from. So we need all four of these to actually be active and voiced in a conversation. And when they're not, or when one or more of them is missing, some common patterns emerge. And what's fascinating about the common patterns is that they often point to a way of looking at breakdown or conflict in our conversations and doing it in a structural way. Structure meaning being able to look at the structure of the conversation. So these are four common stuck patterns that happen in teams. And I don't know about you, but I if just think about for a moment, have you ever been part of a team, could be even a team at home, where you have the same conversation over and over again? I find these to be places where they're like yellow flags where you might start looking for there being one of these common patterns. So we're going to walk through each of these real briefly. The first one is serial moving. So in this pattern, just think about a meeting where you've been in, there's lots of energy, there's lots of ideas, lots of things flowing, and you walk out of there and you're like, yes, that felt like a really great meeting, except I'm not really sure what we accomplished. Serial moving has the feeling of lots of balls in the air, but none of them getting carried to completion. So you have a lot of conversation, it feels like it has a lot of energy, and yet you walk away unclear about what the next step is. So serial moving is the first one. The next one is courteous compliance. And in courteous compliance, this is that place where someone says, this is where we need to go, let's go get sushi, and someone else says, okay, sure. Or, sounds good, just tell me what you want me to do. So courteous compliance over time points to a third phenomenon or pattern that's called covert opposition. So what's happening in courteous compliance is there is a move, let's go get sushi, and someone says, does a follow and says, sure. My vocal action is actually a follow. But if you listen, you can tell by the tone of my voice, maybe some body language, that I might not totally mean what I just said. And what I really intend behind that is I don't really want to get sushi, but for whatever reason, I'm not willing to voice that at this particular moment in time. So I hang on to my oppose, and it's what in this model we begin to call covert opposition, when the thing that's said is different than what I really intend. The other way that we can end up in covert opposition is for somebody to bystand instead of oppose. So that might sound like, let's go get sushi, and someone says, what other places might we go? So there's an inquiry, there's a question and inquiry, and what really might help is if this person were able to really clearly articulate the oppose first. So the last pattern that emerges here is point counterpoint. Now this, if we're thinking about storms and standing in the storms, this one probably might bring to mind the most prominent or vocal conflict is when there is a move on the table and then a very clear oppose. And it can feel like two people are sort of locked in conflict or point counterpoint. And this can sound like, hey, you know, I think we need to take all of our computers in the company and move from Macs to PCs. That's my move. And my oppose is, no way, not going to happen. Absolutely not. So what's happening when move and oppose are the predominant vocal acts in the conversation is that in any of these patterns actually, but in move and oppose, we're missing a follow and a bystand. And so structure becomes, in this particular way, a way to look at how can I bring or call for from someone else one of the missing actions. So in serial moving, a counter to that might be for somebody to bystand and say, hey, hold on, I notice we have 4 different topics on the table right now. Which is the one that we want to explore more right now? Or what's the first one we want to explore? So in the serial moving, a bystand can help change the nature of that. In point counterpoint, we need to change all of the Macs to PCs, and someone says no. If there are no other vocal acts brought into that conversation, it's not going anywhere. But if somebody, either one of these 2 individuals or someone else in the conversation, were to say, tell me more about why you want to make that move. In a sense, it's asking for someone to bystand or say more about what they see. If I'm the one opposing, I don't think we should do that. It can be very helpful for an effective oppose for me to actually start with follow and bystand and then bring my really clear oppose. So that might sound like, you know, a follow to someone's move, I really value what you're proposing and keeping us up to date with technology. That's really true for me as well. That's my follow. A bystand to that might be, I notice that would cost a lot of money, and it's getting to be close to the mid-year, and I worry that financially we might not be ready to do that. My oppose, I don't want to make that decision or that recommendation right now. I'm really opposed to that happening at this moment in time. My new move, can we look at that later this year? Or can we look at a scaled down version of it? So to go from locked opposition, move and oppose, to being able to bridge and find context, something that I can follow or support, something that I'm seeing, being able to name it and bring it into the conversation, keeps us in the conversation and allows us to move forward. So I want to think about just how many times you might be in conversations that feel like they're Groundhog Day conversations. You've had them over and over and over again. And what pattern might the conversation be falling into that I've shared? And how might you change the nature of that conversation by bringing in a different vocal act? So I find it's really fascinating to think about conflict in teams. And for me, one of the things that I used to do long ago was work really hard to manage opposition out of the room. But what I really appreciate now is the voice of opposition is actually needed. And when it's missing in the conversation, when it's not voiced, it is an indicator that it's not there, but that it's likely coming out in either a move or a follow or a bystand. But it's not helpful because it's really difficult to be clear about what someone intends when they're voicing something that they don't actually intend. So I think it gets us turned around and mixed up in a lot of different conflicts that can actually, if you can be able to step back and take a look at the structure, will allow you to take action in a way that would be more meaningful for everybody involved, and it keeps the conversation moving. So that's a bit of a reframe on conflict and how to work with teams in conflict. Can you name what's happening? Can you name structurally what's happening? And can you let the name of the structural pattern inform how you might make an action as a leader or as a facilitator in that conversation? And I'll stop my screen share.
And I'm a little slow on unmuting myself tonight, Marsha. That was an amazing, amazing overview of this topic. Now, for those of you that are new to the AgileTO QuickTalk meetup, the format that we jump into now is that we're going to pepper Marsha here with some questions that she's going to answer. I know that some of you have been here before because I've already got a couple of questions people have sent me through the chat. You've sent them privately, and that's fine. I'm happy to ask them on your behalf. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, just let me know, and you're welcome to unmute yourself. We'll just make sure that we do it in a way that we're not all trying to ask the question at the same time. Or feel free to throw it in the chat, and I'm happy to continue with this. My first one, Marsha, was actually an interesting question that came up here, and someone asks the idea of how do you see these sorts of things happening when you're participating in a meeting that you're facilitating?
You know, I will say I think it takes a little bit of practice to be able sometimes to locate yourself on the periphery of the action. So by that I mean, if I'm facilitating and the conversation is evolving, I'm not always coding exactly what's happening, but when I start to notice either it feels like something's slowing down or it feels like the energy changes in the room, or or we feels like we're getting stuck in some way, I will find a way to just step back. I call it a facilitator fade, to let the group continue in a conversation for a few minutes, enough so that I can get a sense of what's happening and begin to really listen to what's happening, and could I code in move, follow, oppose, and bystand, which of these is really prominent and which might be missing. So I love the question, because as facilitators, we're already managing a lot that's happening already, but I think it can be helpful to just place yourself on the periphery of the conversation for a few minutes.
That's really interesting, taking that step back. It's funny, as you were going, one of the questions that I wrote down here was, can you talk about situations that I've seen many times where people's actions don't represent the words that they say? And you called that out by covert opposition.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you might how you might call that out in a constructive and positive way, because that's going to happen outside of the meeting, probably,
Yeah.
or outside of the event that you're doing. I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to draw attention to that.
It's a really great question. I think about, if I'm with a team or we're in a conversation for a while and there's no pushback. So in a sense, we are experiencing some of that courteous compliance, or there's lots of topics on the table, and we just somebody introduces a new topic, which actually is another way of covertly opposing. If I don't feel like I can push back on you, I'll just change the subject and add something else in. I think a really safe way to do that is just to give, from a facilitation perspective, give people an opportunity to push back. So sometimes I call it, does anybody want to push back on this particular idea? I ask for it. Facilitated activities where you're asking people to look at pros and cons, and doing that anonymously is another way to surface it. So if I feel like it's not there, I'm looking for facilitation techniques that help me surface it, to make it okay to bring in the room.
I'm going to put a plug in here for you on your behalf, and I'm going to encourage anyone who hasn't to pick up a copy of Marsha's book, The Art and Science of Facilitation. And specifically, Marsha, as you were talking, I opened it up to a bookmark page that I have, which is page 66. I'm just putting that in. It's like Order 66 from Star Wars, Execute Order 66, but it's not. It's page 66, and you pose a few questions at the top of that page to encourage that conversation. And I wanted to know if these are the ones that you're talking about. Things like, who sees it differently, or what's true about what you're hearing others say. What's at risk if we don't prioritize these? Like, those could be really engaging questions.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Yes, thank you for pointing to that. I think any kind of question that we can introduce that allows people or gives them space to have a different point of view is critical.
How do you sometimes identify that when you're not sure if it is courteous compliance, or if there truly is alignment in the group? Are there any signs that you've been able to draw on, or any tips that we can look for?
I think sometimes sometimes there is alignment and something moves forward pretty quickly. And sometimes you won't really know. It depends on how long you're working with a team. I look for signs where, I wish I had a better word to describe it, but where it feels like there's maybe very little conversation around something, and people are able to say, yes, I'm on board, but they're not able to. Sometimes I'll ask people to just, can you say a bit more about it, or can you say what you're on board about? Because if they can't, I think that's sometimes the surface response. And if they're not able to articulate more about what that is, I think that's a place to be more curious about it. Anything that gets people into the conversation and has them stay, if it comes back again, I think that's often the yellow flag around a decision wasn't quite as sticky as it could have been. And that often means that we didn't quite have the full conversation, or we didn't really hear what people really thought.
Cool. I'm going to jump back because Tom's just posted a great question here in the chat window, where he's also conveniently put a link to your book on Amazon, which is available on Kindle for only $10 Canadian. This is not meant to be an advertisement. Sorry, it just turned into that for some reason. But Tom's comment in here is really that courteous compliance is so common, and I think I think Tom just likes alliteration with his question here with the C's. But could you drill down maybe a little bit more on some approaches that you've seen to help reduce the impact of courteous compliance in teams?
I think if it's a pattern in a team, it's great to use a retro to talk about what it's like to work in the team. And if you can, in some way, just sharing these kinds of patterns with a team and asking them, like, what's it like for you here? How good are we at saying things that are difficult to say? Or how good are we at talking about what we really need to talk about? Or what's it like to give somebody feedback on this team? I think when you can do it in the abstract, in a way that's not, teams that have a hard time talking about the difficult things will sometimes have a hard time naming it. And so finding a way to give them space that has them reflect, but in a more generic space, and makes it okay. Like, so I think also to normalize that teams do this. And sometimes, depending on where you're at in the team life cycle, certainly teams starting out start in courteous compliance. I think it's just naturally where we end up. We're trying to figure out, I've just joined. It could even be happening for people if they're new to this meetup. They've just joined and they're hanging back and they're silent and they're trying to figure out, I don't know, what's acceptable and not acceptable here? How do I engage? Would this kind of question be okay? And so we're sorting out what works and what doesn't. So it's natural, I think, to be in that space before we begin to take risk. I think what's different is that what does a team do when somebody pushes back or opposes? Because that has the opportunity, if a team can actually follow and oppose, meaning they make space for it, somebody else aligns behind it, there's agreement, and they stay with a conversation when somebody's brave enough to voice the, I don't want to get sushi today. That's the pivotal moment to where conflict can, like a team can work with conflict, or they just pop right back to courteous compliance.
Someone's thrown a note in the chat and they just sent it privately to me, so I'm not going to call them out, but they've made a reference to 2 other sources. And there's a couple other comments in here as well. We'll get to those in a sec, but I'm wondering if you can draw any connection. Someone's made a comment here that it sounds a little bit like you're describing Tuckman's model of team dynamics. And at the same time, you're talking a little bit about the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and the idea that trust is the foundation before we get to healthy conflict.
Yeah, I think those are great models. Mentally, I'll give you another reference that I pull a lot from Otto Scharmer's work on fields of conversation, mainly because his model is very much around behavior and the language that's being spoken. Tuckman, I think there's lots of similarities to it. I don't work with that as much, but I get that comment a lot, that it can feel a bit like that. And Tuckman also looks at a whole lot more than just the conversational dynamic, which we're sort of isolating here.
Very cool.
Yeah.
We've got a special guest all the way from Melbourne, Australia, it looks like. David, I lived in Glen Waverley for a year, so welcome to the AgileTO meetup. David's wondering about a common problem that he sees that I don't think is uncommon, that teams are too busy to spend time digging into what they really think. How do you deal with the fact that people are really busy, lots on their plates?
Aren't we all?
Yeah. It's a great question, David. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's about finding the time to have the conversation for conversations that matter. So if the team feels like they're doing okay and getting their work done, and it doesn't seem like much is getting in the way right now, I'd say keep going, do what you're doing. I think when it feels like something's getting bogged down, or conflict is emerging, or conflict isn't emerging, and we feel like we're missing something in in the oomph, the quality of the work we're producing, I think that's the space to figure out, of all the things that we could talk about, what are the maybe one or two things that we want to carve out to pay a bit more attention to. A decision that matters, something that's critical, that we need it to be sticky, a way in which we want to level up our team. But I think when time is short, and I think it is for all of us, being able to prioritize.
How do these conversations or how do these discussions play out as teams are conducting retrospectives if they have the time? And I think you've touched on that. But the question that's jumping up here that I think might be more interesting to talk about is when we're establishing or reflecting on our team norms.
Mm.
Can you talk about how to how this might manifest or how you've seen it play into the establishment or the evolution of team norms?
Yeah, I think team norms are so critical. I think the conversation actually around team norms is so critical. I think the norm, well, Google's research has showed that quite a bit. But I love to, I will often put up this model or Otto Scharmer's fields of conversation and just ask a team, like, where do you think we are right now? Evidence-wise, like what's the evidence that you see in our day-to-day operations that has you think or believe that? And then to have a conversation about, similar to Jeff, what you've been pointing to is where might we want to make some changes, and then how easy is it to bring? Move, oppose, follow, and bystand are great ones to start with. And if it's a pattern in a team where it's not, maybe we're stuck in courteous compliance, then the question becomes, what's it like to oppose in this team? What's it like to oppose each other? What's it like to oppose direction or a boss? And to have a conversation, whatever it might be. Some people might say, it feels like it's a career-limiting move to do that. Well, that's good to know. Or it feels like it might get me judged or uninvited to the next conversation that we have. And so can we create some agreements around actually we want to welcome it. So the next time someone opposes, we'll agree to voice something that we agree with about what they're saying. I think it can be any of those kinds of norms that get really specific about what's the kind of culture and environment that we want to create.
I love it. And I love that statement about the culture we want to create, a reminder that it's our environment, it's our culture. There are probably 6, it might be more, but there are 6 questions in here in various flavors, all talking about covert oppressors. This seems to be the covert oppression seems to be the hot topic, Marsha, on tonight's call. One of them here specifically, I'll just pick on one, but like I'm not kidding, but one of them here is specific around the product owner on a Scrum team. It is the covert oppressor. I'm wondering if you can maybe dig into that with a little bit more detail, just in general, just because I think there's so many questions around that from folks.
Well, I'm going to have to make up a story about, I love that phrase, covert oppressor. That I think I need to write that down. It's lovely. And I'm going to make up some assumptions about what I'm hearing that might mean is potentially the person that's actually bringing the pattern of covert because they're oppressing the opposed. That's kind of what I hear in that, or they're not welcoming the opposition. Yeah. Here's, around the question of how do you deal with that, I think this falls a lot into if a team feels like they are a victim in some way to behavior of a leader or somebody in some way a positional authority over the team or has authority in some space. And then the next logical conversation or question that comes out of that is it's them, not me. So they're creating this experience where we're not able to voice oppose, that's not welcomed. What do I do about them, or how do I give them that feedback? I think there's, in this model of move, follow, oppose, and bystand, the question becomes, how can you invite them into a conversation that allows for a bit more exploration of that. So just even being able to say, there are things that I see here that I want to oppose, and I don't feel like it's welcomed. And I'm wondering, I just want to check it out. Like, is it okay to oppose the direction of the product or what we're thinking about this product? Is that something that you want to hear from this team or not? So I think it's another one of those examples about if we can't talk about the things, then can we talk about how we're talking about the things as a way through the norm conversation, really.
Really cool. I think you checked off a bunch of questions with that answer. There are just a couple left before we wrap this up, I think. I'm wondering if you can talk about when the conflict arises, when it's flowing from bias. Tom is asking a question here. Now, I'm very lucky. I have no biases whatsoever.
You are lucky.
I'm glad you recognize that.
You just admitted, Jeff, that you're not actually a human.
Right. Right. Well, we know that. How do you address that when the conflict actually comes from something that you can see is coming from someone's perceived bias on a topic or in a situation?
So one of all 4 actions, move, follow, oppose, and bystand. Bystand has, all 4 are needed. Bystand has the ability to change the nature of the conversation the most. So the example I just gave you with the product owner, to be able to name, I feels like it might not be okay to oppose here. I want to check it out. I think the same applies to bias or any experience that you're having. Bystand, when you're, I call them big old bystands because I think it takes courage to say them. But when you can name an experience that you're having, so I might say, gosh, it feels like that's coming from a place of bias, and I know you to be somebody who, values this, values collaboration, or values hearing all voices. And what you're saying at this moment feels like it comes from a different place. Can I check that out? Or, is that experience true for you? Or how does that land for you when I say it? But in some way to be able to name what you're experiencing as a way to give data back to the whole collective conversation.
2 last questions, Marsha. This has been fantastic, by the way. You made a comment on here on the Canter model that it's very much about putting a label or a name to the statement or to the thing that's being said here. I'm wondering, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. This is my gotcha question. Who is the Canadian who is known for saying that the medium is the message?
You got me. I have no idea.
Well, okay. So after this call, I'm going to encourage everyone to go look up Marshall McLuhan,
okay,
who is quoted. And Sue Johnson is on this call, and she could probably tell me the year, but I'm going to guess it was sometime in the 60s, Sue, maybe 50s, maybe even before that, when he was quoted that the medium is the message. And it just reminded me of how important it is to remember that. And I think you've done a great job of reminding us that with the Cantor model and with some of the language that you've used here. So thank you for that. If folks are interested in learning more about Cantor or perhaps even engaging you with some fantastic facilitation tips, in addition to your book, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you or to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Marsha Acker. It's helpful if you tell me, in the message how we met or where you know me. So that's one way. And then you can follow some of my work at teamcatapult.com. So I teach an advanced facilitation class around structural dynamics, and we have a couple of other ways to learn about that. So.
Awesome. And my research has not failed me. Sue has just posted in the chat that I was right on. It was 1964. Thank you very much, Sue.
Hi,
Marsha,
Sue.
thank you so much for spending some time with AgileTO tonight. This was a great talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you everyone for those fantastic questions.